Most of the world agrees, I think, that September 11th, 2001 has thrown a shadow far into the future. Aside from the horror everyone remembers, it's this historic quality that compels our persistent attention. We hope that by thinking about what happened on that morning in New York, Washington, and rural Pennsylvania, and about the events that have been flowing from it, we can learn something of our destiny, of our future, perhaps. But that's not necessarily the case. The more carefully we study history, seems to me, the more we notice its habit of unfolding as a series of improvisations that often surprise even the principal actors. Toward the end of the Civil War, Lincoln wrote, "I claim not to have controlled events, but confess plainly that events have controlled me." It seems likely that George W. Bush, however well or badly his project develops, will at the end of his presidency feel much the same. We should read history, we rightly read history, I say, for the complicated pleasures that it provides, for insight into humanity under the pressure of events, for fragments of wisdom it sometimes leaves behind in our brains. But I think it's doubtful whether history offers a guide to the future or a way to save ourselves from error. One of the great sins of Marxism, I've always thought, was its propagation of the idea that history works in patterns, and that by analyzing the patterns of the past, we can somehow understand the tendencies of the future. To me, that way of thought encourages us to use the word inevitable, which in my experience almost always precedes a serious blunder. Orators used to love quoting Santayana's remark about those who cannot remember the past being condemned to relive it. Yet there's something vaguely fraudulent built into that notion, a false promise of success. So far as I can see, those who do remember the past often come to just as bad an end as those who don't. Was there ever a class of human beings better schooled in history than the young men who emerged from the great universities of Britain and Germany late in the 19th and early in the 20th centuries? Having prepared themselves with the greatest care, they showed what now seems absolutely insane eagerness to plunge into the First World War, which then astonished them and broke all precedents that they could imagine by lasting more than 4 years, killing vast multitudes and nearly destroying European civilization. We could argue the history of the world as they studied it, it did them no good at all in a practical sense, and it may have harmed them by filling their minds with visions of individual glory that modern warfare had rendered marginal or irrelevant. What seems clear to me is that however much we ponder the past or the future, it's the present that is the source of true mystery in our lives. It's the present moment that persistently hides its real nature from us, forcing us to live much of the time in the murk of ignorance. Knowing what is happening just now, at this instant, requires more information and analytic powers than most of us can ever muster. One reason for that, I think, is that we live by assumptions that become part of our belief systems even before we articulate them. In most cases, I believe we understand some convictions that we hold only at the time when we finally reject them. When we've lived through a period of history and seen its beliefs play out, we begin to realize what it was that we once half-consciously thought. For instance, it was assumed in the middle of the 20th century that nationalism was not only discredited by the disastrous wars it had provoked, but was also doomed to extinction under the pressure of an internationalism that was now drawing fresh support from global communications, global trade, and global agencies, most notably the United Nations. Around the same time, when I was very young, when, as Cliff said, I was starting my career as a grade 3 person in journalism, I believe we also assumed at that time that religion as a force in world affairs was disappearing. The death of nationalism was a favorite theme of Marshall McLuhan in the 1950s and the 1960s. Marshall McLuhan, that renowned futurist, a man of many admirable insights, but not always a reliable guide to humanity's fate. Marshall offhandedly dismissed nationalism as a 19th century mode of thought that could only diminish in potency with the passing years. But even as he was saying that, and was being taken very seriously by people like me, new nationalisms were being born and old ones revived. And still others had taken the form of underground streams that flowed beneath nations whose explicit purpose included the extinction of ancient national passions. Yugoslavia being a spectacular case, and for that matter, the Soviet Union. In Western Europe, it's true, certain nationalisms have been diluted by continental union, but nationalism continues to live a vigorous life in many parts of the world. And so, of course, does religion. Who imagined 30 years ago that religious passion, often allied with nationalism, would be a central element in world politics in the early years of the 21st century? A few decades ago, as the great structures of Christianity crumbled and shrank, it seemed clear to many in the West that religion's grip on the human imagination was relaxing. It appeared to both secular optimists and religious pessimists that reason was marching unstoppably across the cultural landscape, or at least a version of reason. Faith was ceasing to be a major component of society, world society, or national society, and was turning into a matter of private choice, almost incidental to politics. Few of us guessed that within North America, many New Age beliefs were arising. Few saw that evangelical Christianity was growing stronger every day, not weaker. And still fewer noticed that Islam was not only making millions of converts across the world, but was simultaneously developing political ambitions and influence. Who imagined that we would be arguing, as I've found myself arguing so often lately, about the nature of Islam and its beliefs and intentions? In Canada, our public discussion of Islamic issues remains superficial, but has already shown us many surprises. For instance, I have known the word jihad to mean holy war for 40 years. But in the last 2 years, people claiming to be true Muslims and representing the Muslim community have told me again and again, often on CBC panel discussions, that this idea, this definition of jihad is entirely wrong. That in fact jihad means struggle, an inner struggle, a struggle for goodness and godliness. Meanwhile, others, also claiming to be true Muslims, maintain that it still means holy war, and that in fact the holy war is what they are fighting. No one with any experience of Christianity will be surprised to hear religious terminology subjected to such tortured interpretation. But in the midst of crisis, Islam has proven for all of us an especially slippery topic. And yet a topic no one today can ignore. Discussions of this kind have replaced the culture wars that dominated intellectual argument in North America in the 1990s. To put it another way, September 11th internationalized the culture wars. Intellectuals spent a dozen or more years, beginning around 1988, spent a dozen or more years arguing about how the young should be educated, which is not a minor issue. But September 11th buried that controversy beneath another one: how terror should be answered, and to what extent multiculturalism can accommodate communities such as the Muslims within open and democratic societies. In the first months after September 11th, Muslim spokesmen managed to turn discussion away from the actual atrocities and toward the emotional health and physical safety of their co-religionists in North America. At the same time, however, a large divide opened between many Muslims and many other elements in our society. At issue is what we consider civilized and what we don't. Many in the West and elsewhere are only driven farther away from sympathetic understanding of Islam when they learn that 7 out of 10 Palestinians say they approve of suicide bombings. In the last 2 years, non-Muslims and many Muslims as well have been forced to look back on what we knew about Islam before we realized that we needed to know a great deal more. While September 11th has thrown its shadow forward, it's also forced us to revisit the years before. 22 years ago, in one of several attempts to achieve a modest level of understanding, I read V.S. Naipaul's book, Among the Believers, An Islamic Journey. Naipaul went to several Islamic countries, spent time with many Muslim clerics and laymen, and tried to capture the essence of their conversation. He wrote with his trademark mingling of curiosity and condescension, distancing himself from Islam as much as he could, pouncing on its inconsistencies. What seemed odd to me about his book at the time was that he had no idea what made Islam so appealing to so many, and apparently had little interest in finding out. In retrospect, however, what seems much odder to me is that he did not understand that some version of the religion he was dismissing with casual ease was capable of shaking the world. And yet it was less than 2 years from the publication of that unworried book to October 23rd, 1983, when a suicide bomber drove a truck containing 6 tons of explosives into the Marine barracks at Beirut Airport. The explosion he set off could be heard 30 miles away. It killed 241 Americans. They were there along with French, British, and Italian soldiers as part of a multinational peacekeeping force intended to protect Lebanon from the Syrian invasion and also to contain its civil war. The killing of the Marines was the work of Hezbollah, an Islamic terrorist group which considered the peacekeepers an impediment to its own plans for Lebanon. Tragically, among terrorist operations, this was a great success. Washington was mortified by the failure to protect its men and horrified by the human cost of what had seemed a relatively safe mission. Under congressional pressure, Ronald Reagan withdrew U.S. forces from Lebanon. Since that day, which was 20 years and 1 week ago, Lebanon has been living in misery under Syria and Hezbollah, which for practical purposes are interchangeable entities. Once a prosperous and hopeful country containing the Paris of the Middle East, as they called Beirut, it is now a failure in all conceivable ways. That truck bomb could have been seen by Washington as a declaration of war. And perhaps there were those who understood it that way. But so far as the world knew, it was a terrorist incident, an especially monstrous one, but isolated. I think we hoped and assumed that it was the work of marginal fanatics. There were other reasons for muffling its effect on the international public. Washington was much more worried about relations with the Soviet Union, and of course Syria was a Soviet client. Furthermore, diplomats in all countries understood that to interpret that bombing for what it was, that is in broad strategic terms, would not only disturb American opinion, but would also threaten stability in the Middle East. So for the most part, the Marines were forgotten. Hezbollah was viewed by the authorities with continuous suspicion, but little else. And as one of the survivors of that attack remarked just a week ago, the Marines' sacrifice was in vain. The great problem here was the failure to interpret the present. Dozens of incidents followed, but no one with moral and political authority cared to trace the lines connecting them. There was no general understanding that a new kind of war had started. Intelligence services went about their work, incompetently in many cases, as we now know. Terrorist organizations were identified, individuals were prosecuted, but the West in general saw no way to change its easygoing, no reason to change its easygoing ways. Perhaps that was partly the legacy of the Cold War. The Cold War lasted so long that many of us began to imagine that it was a permanent condition of life. If we dreamt of it ending, then we imagined, those who could stretch their imaginations far enough to see beyond the Cold War, we imagined that it would be followed by something quite different, a non-war, not at all warlike. Certainly, the West, exhausted by 45 years of suspended nuclear terror, was unwilling to consider a new conflict, and therefore was in no position to notice that a major struggle had begun, a struggle in which not only the Islamic world and the West were implicated, but the population of the whole planet. September 11, 2001 was a magnet dropped on a table among iron filings. It rearranged everything that surrounded it, destroying the old patterns, abruptly creating new ones. It touched many, many corners of life. If you turn to the business pages, every airline that's threatened with bankruptcy begins by talking about September 11th. On television, we see ourselves watching espionage dramas, not about James Bond-like figures going to the ends of the earth to find the evil geniuses, but about people in a mosque down the street plotting bombs. Above all, of course, September 11th changed the United States, changed its status in the world, its view of itself, its responsibilities, its policies. It turned the Bush administration upside down. Bush began his first year in office as a non-interventionist president, fixing his rhetoric within a version, an up-to-date version, but a version nevertheless of the ancient no foreign entanglement style of the Americans. He ended that first year not only entangled in countries far beyond his shores, notably Pakistan and Afghanistan, but also committed to much further entanglements, perhaps even endless entanglements. Terrorism did this to George W. Bush and did it also to his successors. Terrorism also led the U.S. towards unilateralism and altered the topography of international relations. The prospect of a war in Iraq, which to the Americans seemed the most natural and necessary step, drove a wedge between the U.S. and two old allies, Germany and France. They had been living, Germany and France, for more than 4 decades under the protective umbrella of American power, and in that period had developed an almost pacifist view of the world. They'd come to see the Americans as excessively belligerent and unreasonable. Now, the old form of European anti-Americanism, perfected in Paris in the 10 years after 1945, saw Moscow and Washington as moral equivalents, each of them set on world conquest. The new form of anti-Americanism sees Iraq as a kind of victim of the U.S., not innocent, but a victim nevertheless. It also sees the Americans as careless, thoughtless, and trigger-happy. These last 2 years have opened up in Europe a new era of condescension toward America, and some European reactions to post-war terrorism have contained more than trace elements of Schadenfreude. Nor is Schadenfreude, the habit of taking joy in the discomfort of others, uniquely the response of the Europeans. I've often heard the sound of it in Canada in the last while. I've read it in editorials, I've noticed it on TV. When Peter Mansbridge on The National informed CBC viewers that Bush had been forced to ask the United Nations for post-war help in Iraq, he came as close as man's bridge ever comes to public ecstasy. In Europe, there were logical reasons for surprise over American unilateralism. After all, it was the United States that imported multilateralism into Europe when it supported the European coal and steel community, which is the forerunner of the European Union, when it made the Marshall Plan contingent on cooperation, economic cooperation among the various states, and above all, when it developed NATO as a cooperative defense system. America's conversion to unilateral action last winter, of course it wasn't exactly unilateral, but that's how it seemed and that's how it was cast. This left Europe confused and conflicted. It happens that Italy and Spain, as well as Britain, took the American side. So at the moment when the European Union was preparing to transform itself yet again with the admission of new members, it discovered that it was spending its time arguing over its relations with what had always been its best friend, its co-founder, in fact, the country that had, in many ways, originally called the European Union into being. Perhaps more important still, September 11th converted the Bush administration to the concept of the preemptive strike. In the Cold War, the preemptive strike was a theory and a threat, not a reality, and certainly not a pressing necessity. But in this new era, Washington saw no alternative but to search out the terrorists before they could attack again. This meant intervention, it meant preemptive action. Iraq was just such an action on a grand scale. The U.S. suspected that Iraq had, or soon would have, weapons of mass destruction. Certainly the evasiveness of Saddam Hussein convinced me that he had them, and seemed to support every possible suspicion. In any case, the Americans went ahead, believing it was their responsibility to prevent a great danger. Much of the world wanted to wait instead for clear evidence, but in the American view, waiting could be disastrous. For the Americans, this was also a kind of symbolic war, a warning to others. Their war on Iraq was a way of saying that the U.S. in this era would not long tolerate rogue states with nuclear weapons or similarly dangerous instruments of destruction. Unfortunately, Washington has not found the words to articulate this doctrine effectively. Much of the world has been left trying to infer from its actions what it plans for the future. Michael Ignatieff is among the many commentators who have complained about this. As he says, the Iraq War has had some good immediate consequences. A totalitarian regime has fallen. The true dimensions of Saddam's terror stand revealed in detail for the first time. Hundreds of thousands of formerly oppressed Shiites can be seen marching to their shrine. Iraqis at all levels now express themselves with relative freedom. If some of them use this freedom to demand that their American liberators go home as soon as possible, then that too should be seen as an accomplishment of the war. In sum, as Ignatieff says, quote, if the consequence of intervention is a rights-respecting Iraq in a decade or so, who cares whether the intentions that led to it were mixed at best? Still, he goes on to say that the Bush administration has produced no clear policy on intervention. After Iraq, what? Ignatieff looks for what he calls policy coherence, a policy on foreign intervention that could be stated clearly and explained in a persuasive way to the American public and the world. But some American defenders of the American position might point out that its actions have been, of necessity, largely improvised month by month, and not much of it can be expressed as long-term policy. Nor do the Americans find it convenient or comfortable to be absolutely open about their intentions. It seems clear that destabilizing the Middle East is one major goal. They want democratic change there, and they're willing to bet lives and great fortunes on their chance of achieving it. Destabilizing the various tyrannies will be part of their method. In Canadian politics, the effect of September 11th has, of course, been entirely different. The crisis has rolled out as a painful series of missteps, contradictions, hesitations, misunderstandings, and then finally a refusal by the Government of Canada, with the support of the people, so far as we can tell, to become involved. Our national discussions are slowly leading us to an understanding of our place in the world, a new understanding, I think. Since the 1960s, we have been reducing military expenditures, allowing the Americans or Europeans to take up the slack, and NATO when necessary. We've known that nothing really bad can happen to us because the Americans won't let it happen. From the beginning of the Trudeau period to the present, we have not considered military preparedness a significant element in the federal government. Now we begin to realize that this has made us more or less irrelevant in world politics. We joined the Americans on Afghanistan and on the war against terror in general, perhaps, and we declined to join them in the war against Iraq. But in neither case did our decision mean much to anyone except the men and women in the armed services. Meanwhile, anti-Americanism in Canada has developed to levels not experienced in the last half century, and Canada-US relations have radically deteriorated. Something else really striking has happened. The Liberal Party has chosen a new leader who has run for the leadership, so far as I can tell, without enunciating a foreign policy. I don't believe anything like that has ever happened before during a critical period. The fact that this can pass without public comment of any length suggests the place of world affairs in the popular imagination of this country. Last week, in a lecture on terrorism, Vivian Rakoff quoted a saying that all terrorism is theater. Terrorism, by its nature, must be a kind of performance. Its targets must be symbolic, not simply instrumental. Considered in this way, the attack on Israeli wrestlers at the Olympic Games in 1972 was a performance on the world stage, and it was celebrated by the terrorists for precisely that reason. It was a demonstration of what could be done. In the same sense, the purpose of the bomb in Beirut was not to kill a certain number of Marines. It was to show the Americans they could no longer stay in Lebanon because radical Islam would make their life unendurable and make their policy unacceptable to the public back home. On a much larger scale, September 11th was charged with symbolism, using a great accomplishment of American technology, the commercial airliner, to destroy two skyscrapers, icons of American capitalism and materialism. It was this intense symbolism that created an unprecedented impact and set in motion all that followed. The German philosopher Jürgen Habermas remarked that live TV transformed this event into a global tragedy, and as he put it, made the world population a benumbed witness. Habermas suggested that, quote, perhaps September 11th could be called the first historic world event in the strictest sense. The impact, the explosion, the slow collapse, everything took place in front of the universal eyewitness of a global public. Partly because of the unique quality that Habermas identifies, September 11th turned into the organizing principle of world politics and inaugurated a new climate of opinion. It replaced the Cold War as the point of reference for world politics. In a certain way, however, it was more confusing than the Cold War, and perhaps always will be. No one would for a moment wish for a return to the geopolitical atmosphere we lived through until the Soviet Union fell. But in a certain way, the Cold War was, by comparison, almost comfortable. For all its real and potential horrors, it responded to the universal human need to seek meaning through structure. It was, unlike the conflict now engaging the world, it was intellectually coherent. The struggle inaugurated by radical Muslims, as I suggested, was already long in process before most of the West began discussing it. And when we did start to think about it, we had great difficulty naming it and understanding it. Was it primarily a religious event in origin, as many stated, or was it something else? No brief description can cover the diverse array of impulses, beliefs, and desires behind November 11th, or behind Islamic terror in general. I think the case of Syria illustrates the principle. Now, Syria exports terrorism, and we know that certain Islamic mosques within Syria preach terrorism. But we can't ignore the fact that the government of Syria and the Islamists traditionally despise each other. In 1982, Syria identified the Islamists, the Muslim Brotherhood, as a threat to the national government. So the president, Hafez al-Assad, sent an army into Hama, the city that became their headquarters. His troops killed about 10,000 people and destroyed the city. Damascus and the Islamists might agree that the US and Israel are both evil, but beyond that, they have been, so far as outsiders could tell, enemies. In recent years, however, the government has encouraged certain of the mosques, and the mosques have emphasized the intransigent Wahhabi Islam of Saudi Arabia. At the same time, Syria continues to keep many Islamists in prison. And of course, September 11th forced Syria onto the defensive. Then, as I said, a Soviet client. Now it was robbed of its patron. With the fall of Saddam Hussein, it lost a close ally. More recently, it has cooperated in certain ways with the United States. So its entire situation in the world is enormously complicated. Middle East forces, ranging from Baathists to religious parties, exhibit diverse ideologies, but their goals are related. Most are anti-American and anti-West. Most look back to a great past, which they believe was somehow stolen from them. Just about all of them grotesquely overstate the power of Israel and depict that tiny sliver of land as a major threat to their people. In fact, Israel and Zionism have become the greatest assets in the rhetorical armory of Arab governments. An Arab state may starve its citizens and allow them few rights, but it can always claim that at least it protects them from what it is taught to fear most, and what they're taught to fear most, Zionism. And so long as anti-Zionist propaganda dominates their media, their story remains plausible. Arabia has for a long time been a network of interlocking tyrannies, each of them a failure in its own way, all of them connected fragments of a world that once dreamt of unity, and even in the age of Nasser 4 decades ago, briefly glimpsed it as a lively possibility. The result is that sorting out the meaning of any specific action, even something so flagrant as September 11th, can be difficult. Obviously, September 11th expresses Osama bin Laden's religious zealotry, but it carries echoes of the Arab nationalism that was, in living memory, the main political current in the Middle East. In the present crisis, religious fundamentalism and political nationalism appear to be overlapping. In fact, September 11th seemed to suggest to some that religion was being used as a new language for old political goals. Politics in the Middle East has several curious qualities, and one of them is that failure, even long-term failure, seems to have no negative consequence. Yasser Arafat, for instance, has over 40 years accomplished nothing for the Palestinian people. Their lives have not improved, nor have they acquired a state of their own as promised. But perhaps Arafat has mastered symbolism better than anyone else. In Israel and the territories, Palestinian bombing, either encouraged or tolerated by Arafat, has produced no social benefits and created many difficulties. Yet, reasonably reliable polls say that Arafat remains by far the most admired Palestinian. Across the Middle East, among the Palestinians, the Iranians, and the Lebanese, the disturbances of the last 2 years have brought a few hopeful signs of democratic politics, all of them in some way the result of September 11th. Even Saudi Arabia has been showing modest signs of change. It has been a great embarrassment that one of the alleged allies of the United States is also the most rigidly conservative and dictatorial of the Arab states. Saudi money has been used to preach and practice radical Islamist politics around the world. At home, the Saudis have run a state that is in many ways as backward as any on the face of the earth. For a long time, high oil prices allowed the Saudis to provide relatively good services and incomes for their people, but as oil revenues have lowered and the population has increased, desperate social problems have appeared. It's said that about a third of young men have no jobs. Surprisingly, the solution now offered by the Saudis is the beginning of democracy. It announced this month that it will hold elections for municipal councils next year. This is no more than a first modest step toward reform, but it acknowledges, as the Saudis seldom do, that they need change. Kenneth Pollack of the Brookings Institution in Washington has suggested that with luck, this could be a turn toward democracy in the Arab countries. As he puts it, quote, as long as the Saudis keep moving down this path, no matter how sluggishly, it will be hard for the other countries of the region not to follow. Perhaps America's vigorous and angry response to September 11th will lead to other improvements in the Middle East. Meanwhile, September 11th and its aftermath have raised two enormous questions that will be with us for many years. Both of them will have to be dealt with before we can truly understand even the actions of the moment. First, the Americans obviously believe that they cannot surrender their sphere of influence in the Middle East. They may not use precisely those words, sphere of influence, because those words carry powerful 19th century echoes of European imperialism and powerful 20th century echoes of the Nazis and the Soviets carving up Eastern Europe in 1939. Nevertheless, it is, in fact, a sphere of influence that the Americans are talking about and fighting for. In this sense, American policy is grounded in the question of oil, as the enemies of the Americans insist. But what's at stake is the world's oil, not specifically oil for the U.S. The Americans understand that for many years to come, the world economy will require a presence in the oil fields of the Middle East. Ideally, this presence will result from cooperation with Middle Eastern democracies arising from the physical rubble and the political chaos of this period. As I say, that is the ideal situation. But one way or another, the U.S. will remain there. This means that if necessary, it will cooperate with new versions of the often hideously unattractive governments that have dominated the region for generations. The question this raises will cause painful difficulties for idealists and will not be much easier for those who pride themselves on hard-boiled realism. What does this kind of power mean in the 21st century? Is it either morally acceptable or practically workable? Will citizens of the democracies, including the U.S., continue to pay for it and continue to ignore the ethical problems it raises? In the past, the Europeans could maintain their overseas interests more or less out of sight. But in our time, TV cameras will go everywhere that Americans go. And even if Americans and others agree to revive and maintain the sphere of influence concept, as seems reasonable to me, will it remain possible in a time of terrorist resistance? Because policy has been made on the run since September 11th, Because it shows all the marks of improvisation, we've hardly begun to sort out those issues. The other question September 11th has left with us is related to the nature of our own society. Islamists have produced what they believe is a persuasive argument that we might call the anti-West narrative. In their telling, the West, through various corrupt means, has taken over the world, humbled what it considers lesser religions, and humiliated Islamic countries in particular. Somehow, the West has managed to accomplish all this while sliding into decadence, weakness, and cowardice. However that may be explained, it's clear that the West, from this perspective, and above all America, must be opposed by men of virtue. We've now heard this story many times, often to the accompaniment of bombs. But if an anti-West narrative exists, is there a pro-West narrative? Can we state why our civilization deserves to be defended? 30 or 40 years ago, no one bothered to ask such a question, the answer being obvious. But in recent times, our moral position has changed. I think of 1992 and the 500th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival in this hemisphere. At that time, institutions across the United States, including the federal government, made a point of not celebrating his voyage. It was commemorated, to be sure. It was duly noted. But it was understood that anything expressing enthusiasm or even approval would offend indigenous peoples. The idea that something splendid happened in 1492 was not to be expressed. A couple of generations of apologies to various groups have put liberal democracy on the defensive, in particular the most articulate and intellectual members of society, and among them perhaps particularly the educators and the journalists. Today, we don't much like expressing approval of the institutions that sustain our lives. We take them for granted, complain when they are threatened or damaged, but rarely spend much time explaining why they matter to us. Many believe this is precisely how it should be in a free society. On the other hand, a society under attack and seeking to remain free, perhaps even to extend its freedoms to others, may decide that it's essential to express the compelling justifications for its own existence in its present form, or something like it. Perhaps, however, this has always been a problem in the secular democracies. Perhaps it's merely one of the many problems on which the events of September 11, 2001 cast a fresh light. Thank you very much.